Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. So here's the tension we're all living in, right? We're constantly told we have to make a choice. It's presented as this hard binary. You either choose science, reason, logic, or you choose God, faith, religion. But what if that choice is a complete logical error? What if asking someone to choose between God and science is literally like asking them to choose between Henry Ford and engineering to explain a car? Today, we're questioning that whole narrative, the one that says atheism is the thinking person's default. We're exploring a source that argues the exact opposite.
It is a pretty bold claim. We're looking at a talk given at the Oxford Union by John Lennox.
Oh, the Oxford mathematician.
That's the one. He's also a philosopher of science
Yeah.
and, a man who stood on stage and debated some of the biggest names in new atheism.
Like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens.
Exactly.
And what I love about this particular talk has been making the rounds on the Daily Dose of Wisdom channel is that Lennox isn't really thumping a Bible. He's thumping a lectern with history and logic.
That's a good way to put it. His whole argument is that if you actually follow the trajectory of scientific history, if you look at the nature of the human mind, and if you analyze the roots of our morality, they don't point toward atheism. He argues they point directly toward theism.
So our mission today is to unpack what Lennox calls this tapestry of arguments. We're going to look at everything from the origins of the universe to, well, the concept of human rights. And just to be super clear, we aren't here to tell you what to believe. We're just here to trace the logic he's laying out.
Let's start with that hook you mentioned, the Henry Ford analogy, because this is really the tool he uses to dismantle the whole God of the gaps argument.
Right, the God of the gaps. That's the idea that God is just a placeholder for stuff science hasn't figured out yet. Like, we don't know what makes thunder, so it must be Thor.
Right. And then once we know about atmospheric pressure, Thor is out of a job.
The assumption is that as science gets bigger, God gets smaller.
They're competing for the same explanatory space. But Lennox says this is a category mistake. He wants you to imagine a motor car, a Ford Model T specifically.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
So if you want to understand that car, you study engineering. You learn about internal combustion, spark plugs, and transmission. That explains how the car works. That's the mechanism.
Right. And you could study that mechanism for 100 years. You could become the world's leading expert on that Ford engine.
But here's the question. If you dismantle that engine and study every single atom, will you ever find Henry Ford inside the cylinder?
No, obviously not.
So does that mean Henry Ford didn't exist? Or that he isn't necessary to explain the car?
No, it just means he's not part of the machinery.
Precisely. Henry Ford is the agent. He explains why the car exists and where it came from. Engineering explains the mechanism. Lennox's point is that God and science are just different kinds of explanations.
You don't choose between the inventor and the instruction manual.
You need both to really understand the car.
I think that's why this argument really sticks with people. It just deflates the whole conflict. It's not a cage match between God and physics.
They're answering different questions. And Lennox backs this up with history. This is the part that I think usually surprises people who have only heard the science versus religion narrative.
Oh, yeah. We're all taught that the church held science back.
Galileo, the Inquisition, all of that.
Sure.
And that happened, of course. But Lennox looks at the bigger picture. He points out that the explosion of science in the 16th and 17th centuries, the scientific revolution itself, didn't happen in spite of belief in God. It happened because of it.
That feels so counterintuitive. How does religion fuel science?
Well, he quotes Alfred North Whitehead, a brilliant mathematician and philosopher. And Whitehead pointed out that the early scientists, people like Kepler, Galileo, Newton, they became scientific because they expected law in nature.
They expected the universe to follow rules.
Right. And why did they expect rules? Because they believed in a lawgiver.
Yeah.
They believed the universe was created by a rational mind, so they expected it to behave rationally.
That makes a lot of sense. If you thought the universe was just random chaos or ruled by a dozen different gods who are always fighting each other, you wouldn't bother trying to find a mathematical constant.
Exactly. You wouldn't look for order in chaos. Lennox brings up Isaac Newton. When Newton discovered the law of gravity, he didn't say, "Great, I found a mechanism, so now I don't need God."
He didn't fire the agent because he found the mechanism.
No. He wrote the Principia Mathematica, arguably the most important book in scientific history, specifically to glorify the creator. For Newton, doing science was like thinking God's thoughts after him. The more he understood the machine, the more he admired the architect.
So this whole idea that you have to be an atheist to be a serious scientist, Lennox is saying that's actually a pretty modern invention.
He's saying It ignores the very roots of science itself. But then he moves on from history to something even, well, trippier. He tackles the rationality of the universe today.
This is the math problem.
In a way, yeah. He starts with a quote from Einstein. The only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible.
Which is a great line, but break it down for us. Why is that weird?
Well, think about what you're doing when you do physics. You have a mathematician, right, sitting in a room thinking abstract thoughts inside their head. In here. They scribble some symbols math on a piece of paper.
Right.
And somehow, those abstract thoughts perfectly match what the universe is doing billions of light years away, out there. The math just works. We can predict where a planet will be in 1,000 years using thoughts from inside our own skulls. Lennox just asks.
Why? Why does the software in our heads match the hardware of the universe?
Exactly. And this is where Lennox sets a kind of logical trap. He brings in the philosopher Alvin Plantinga to challenge the atheist, or more specifically, the naturalist worldview.
Okay, walk us through this slowly, because this is where the logic can get a little dense.
So the naturalist view is that nature is all there is. No God, no design, just physics and biology.
If that's true, then the human mind is the product of a mindless, unguided evolutionary process.
Natural selection.
Right. And what is the primary function of natural selection? What does it optimize for?
Survival. Passing on your genes,
Yeah,
not getting eaten by a lion.
correct. It optimizes for survival, not for truth. So if our brains are just survival machines built by a series of random accidents, why on earth should we trust them to understand deep truths about reality?
I see. Just because a belief helps you survive, that doesn't make it true. Like if I believe all rustling grass is a tiger, I'll run away, that helps me survive. But it might just be the wind. The truth doesn't matter, only the reaction.
Precisely. Lennox argues that if you accept the pure atheist view, you have a really hard time justifying why you should trust your own brain. It's like realizing your computer was built by a random number generator. You wouldn't trust the calculations it gives you. So the argument is, if you remove God, you actually undermine the very tool reason that you're using to argue against God in the first place.
That is the logic trap. Lennox says the theistic explanation is much simpler and, well, more coherent. Science works because the universe out there and the human mind in here are both products of the same intelligent divine mind, the Logos.
We can understand the universe because we're made in the image of the one who made the universe. It kind of guarantees the connection.
Exactly. It gives you a reason to trust reason.
Okay, so that's the intellectual side, the math, the history. But Lennox pivots pretty hard in this talk. He moves from the head to the heart. He starts talking about morality.
And this is important because this is usually where the debate gets really heated.
And Lennox makes a very clear distinction here. He is not saying that you need religion to be a moral person.
No, and he stresses that. He says he knows many atheists who are incredibly moral, ethical people. He's not attacking their behavior. He's questioning their foundation.
He's asking, where do those morals actually come from?
Right. He quotes Jürgen Habermas, who's a heavy hitter in philosophy and a self-proclaimed atheist. And Habermas makes this fascinating admission. He says that everything we value in the West, universal human rights, freedom, democracy, the very idea that the individual matters, is the direct legacy of the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love.
So basically the idea that every human is created in the image of God.
Habermas says there is, and this is his quote, no alternative to this foundation. We're essentially living off the fumes of a religious heritage.
It's like we're cutting down the tree but still expecting the fruit to keep growing every single season.
And Lennox illustrates what happens when you fully uproot that tree. He tells a story about his time in Russia. He spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe during the Cold War.
This part of the talk was chilling. He recounts a conversation with a scientist at the Russian Academy of Sciences.
Yeah, and the scientist looked at him and said, "We thought we could abolish God and retain a value for human beings. We found we couldn't."
And then he adds, and we murdered millions of them.
It's a brutal reality check. Lennox references Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian dissident. Solzhenitsyn said the catastrophe of the Soviet Union happened because, quote, men have forgotten God.
So the argument is, if there's no creator, then human value is subjective. It's based on what you can do or what the state decides you're worth.
It becomes utilitarian. If you're useful to the economy, you have value. If you're old or sick or a dissident, you become disposable.
But the Christian view, the Imago Dei, says your value is intrinsic. It's built in. No government gave it to you, so no government can take it away.
That's the crucial difference. And Lennox is arguing that even atheists, when they talk about human rights, are borrowing capital from a Christian worldview to do it.
It's a heavy argument. It definitely raises the stakes from who built the atoms to why do people even matter?
It does. But then Lennox brings it back down to earth with a much simpler analogy. He talks about Aunt Matilda and her cake.
Oh, I love this part. It's the perfect way to explain the limits of science.
So, the scenario is, Aunt Matilda has baked a beautiful cake, and we bring in a team of Nobel Prize-winning scientists to analyze it.
They can tell you everything about the mechanism of the cake. The proteins, the chemical bonds, the nutritional breakdown.
They can tell you how the cake was made. But can they tell you why it was made?
No. Was it for a birthday? A wedding? Maybe a bribe?
Science is silent on that. You can analyze the frosting under a microscope for 1,000 years, but you will never find the purpose of the cake.
The only way to know the purpose is if Aunt Matilda tells you.
She has to reveal it, and Lennox connects this directly to the universe. We have brilliant science that explains the mechanism of the universe, the Big Bang, evolution, gravity. But if we want to know why we're here, science hits a wall.
We need the maker to speak. This is the whole concept of revelation.
And this is where Lennox really stops being a generic deist, believing in some distant creative force, and starts talking about the specific claims of Christianity. He argues that the maker has spoken.
And he calls it the crunch issue, the resurrection.
He argues that Christianity isn't a philosophy or a set of moral rules. Not at its core. It's a historical claim. Did Jesus of Nazareth rise from the dead, or didn't he?
It's completely binary. If he didn't, the whole thing is a fraud. If he did, well, everything changes.
Yeah, Lennox references Lord Anderson, a legal expert, who called the empty tomb a veritable rock that rationalistic theories just crash against. Lennox suggests that when you actually look at the historical evidence, the empty tomb, the eyewitnesses, the sudden explosion of the church in Jerusalem, the resurrection is the most logical explanation for what happened.
But he knows that for most people, the barrier isn't history, it's pain.
The problem of evil. If God is good, why do bad things happen? And Lennox doesn't dodge this at all. He mentions his own niece, who died of a tumor at age 22.
That's heartbreaking. And it's usually the ace card for atheism. Look at all the suffering. There can't possibly be a God.
But Lennox flips the script again. He admits that atheism solves the intellectual problem of pain. If there is no God, pain isn't a problem to be solved. It's just bad luck. It's just molecules bumping into each other.
But what do you lose with that solution?
You lose hope, and you lose justice. If death is the end, then the millions of people who have suffered unimaginable injustice, the victims of the gulags, the victims of cancer, they never get justice. The story just cuts to black.
Lennox contrasts this with the Christian response. He says God didn't remain distant from it all. He entered the suffering.
The cross. Lennox argues that God took the pain upon himself. And because of the resurrection, there is a promise of ultimate justice. So the choice isn't between a world with pain and a world without pain. We all live in a world with pain.
The choice is between a world where pain is meaningless and final, or a world where pain is temporary and justice is guaranteed.
Precisely.
As we start to wrap this up, the commentator on that video used a word you mentioned earlier, tapestry.
Yes. And I think that's the key takeaway here. Lennox isn't saying that any one of these arguments proves God on its own. He's saying that when you put them all together, the history of science, the math, the need for objective morality, the historical evidence for the resurrection, they form a coherent worldview.
They all fit together.
Right. The commentator used the analogy of a spouse. Knowing God is experiential. It's like knowing your husband or your wife. If someone tried to prove to you mathematically that your spouse in the next room didn't exist, you wouldn't argue with them.
You'd laugh.
You'd laugh because you know them. It's relational, not just theoretical.
And that's the level of certainty Lennox is talking about.
So we've covered a lot of ground today, from Ford engines to Russian dissidents.
But I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on, and goes back to that survival versus truth paradox we talked about earlier.
The idea that if our brains just evolve for survival, we can't really trust them to find truth.
Exactly. So here's the provocative question. If you truly believe that your thoughts are nothing more than chemical reactions selected for survival, can you ever actually claim to know that that belief is true? Or are you just believing it because it helps you survive in some way?
It's a completely circular problem.
And if that's the case, What does that say about every debate you've ever had? Are we arguing about truth, or are we just biological machines bumping into each other in the dark?
That's a question that might just unravel everything.
Thanks for thinking deeper with us. We'll see you next time.